The cold came in under the doors that January morning the way it always did in Vancouver, not sharp but persistent, settling into the linoleum and the fluorescent hum of the corridor until the whole hospital felt like it was bracing against something. Dean Hollis had worked the night rotation at St. Margrave General long enough that he had learned to ignore the cold by keeping moving. He pressed his rounds steadily through the executive wing on the 6th floor, his security badge swinging lightly against his chest, his boots quiet on the polished floor. It was 3:47 in the morning. Most of the wing was dark and sealed. Finance, operations, human resources, all locked behind frosted glass, the kind of offices that only made decisions in daylight with expensive coffee, pressed shirts. But at the far end of the corridor, the main boardroom glowed. Not the usual glow of overnight cleaning staff. Something sharper. The kind of light that meant people who were not supposed to be awake were making decisions that could not wait. Dean slowed without meaning to. Through the narrow sidelight window beside the boardroom door, he could see suits, at least 8. A projector casting numbers against the far wall. A woman at the head of the table. Catherine Osey, chair of the board and the closest thing St. Margrave had to a chief executive, leaning forward with her hands flat on the surface and her expression the color of someone who had not slept. He kept walking. It was not his business. He made it 12 steps down the corridor before he noticed the paper. A single sheet lying face up on the floor beneath the communal printer in the alcove between the boardroom and the stairwell. Someone had printed it and either forgotten it or walked away too fast. Dean picked it up out of reflex. His job was the floor, including what accumulated on it, and he was already straightening to set it face down on top of the printer when one number caught him hard enough to stop his hand mid-motion. Not a number exactly, a figure, an asset valuation line for diagnostic imaging equipment. A total so far below what it should have been that Dean stood motionless in the alcove light for a full 3 seconds, rereading the same row. He knew that number was wrong. He knew it the way someone knows a familiar street has changed before they can name what moved. He had spent 18 months before Page was born auditing capital equipment valuations for a medical supply distributor in Calgary. He had sat across tables from hospital procurement officers and insurance adjusters, arguing over depreciation schedules for MRI units and CT systems, line by line, machine by machine, until the numbers stopped being abstract and became something with weight and age and consequence. He had learned in that specific and unglamorous way what that equipment was actually worth versus what finance departments wanted it to be worth on paper. The figure on the sheet was less than half of what the imaging floor at St. Margrave should have carried. Dean looked back toward the boardroom. Through the narrow window, he watched Catherine reach for a pen. He put the page under his arm and walked to the boardroom door. Inside, no one noticed him immediately. Then Lawrence Peel, the hospital's chief financial officer, looked up from his seat to Catherine's right, and his expression moved through 3 stages in under a second. Confusion, irritation, and something sharper beneath both. "This area is restricted," Lawrence said. Not loud, but the kind of quiet that expected instant compliance. Every head turned, 8 faces in tailored jackets and corporate composure, all staring at a man in a gray security uniform, holding a piece of paper against his side. Catherine looked at him with something more careful. Not dismissal, evaluation. Dean Hollis had spent 4 years doing rounds through this hospital. He knew how absurd he looked. He had thought about walking back through that door from the moment he had pushed it open, but the number on that sheet had settled somewhere behind his sternum and refused to move, and he had learned over the past 7 years that the things that would not leave him alone were usually the things he was supposed to do something about. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, addressing Catherine directly, "but I found this near the printer. There's a valuation figure on it that I don't think is right." Lawrence exhaled through his nose. "You work security?" "Yes, sir." "Then you have exactly nothing to offer this room." He turned back toward the table. "Someone call facilities." But Catherine had not looked away from Dean. Her expression was the kind that came from decades of reading people under pressure, and what she was reading now was clearly not fear. "What figure?" she said. A board member across the table shifted visibly. Lawrence opened his mouth, but Catherine had already moved her eyes to the sheet Dean was holding, and something in her stillness said she was not going to dismiss the next sentence. Dean stepped forward and placed the page on the table in front of her. "The diagnostic imaging equipment is listed at $4.2 million in total asset value. That includes the 2 MRI units on floor 3 and the new PET CT on floor 5. He kept his voice level. "That equipment was installed over the past 8 years. Even accounting for full straight-line depreciation, the floor value shouldn't be below $11 million. The way it's listed here, it looks like impairment adjustments were applied that don't line up with the service records. Silence settled over the boardroom the way it does when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Lawrence's voice came back harder. Impairment adjustments are applied by certified accountants following regulatory guidelines, not by security staff who glanced at a printed page. Catherine looked at Lawrence for a moment. Then she looked back at Dean. How do you know what the floor value should be? Dean did not rush his answer. Before I worked here, I did capital equipment auditing. Medical sector mostly. I haven't done it in several years, but those machines hold their value longer than the write-downs suggest. I know what they cost. I know how they age. The silence stretched. How long have you worked at St. Margrave? Catherine asked. 4 years. Before that? Auditing, then warehouse work, then here. Lawrence leaned back with the manner of a man collecting himself after a momentary annoyance. Catherine, we are 40 minutes from the Meridian signing window. We cannot restructure an acquisition decision because... Run the equipment schedule, Catherine said, looking at the young financial analyst near the corner laptop. His name was Kyle, and he looked like he was deciding whether the next 2 minutes would end his career or save it. Catherine, Lawrence started again. Run it, Kyle. Kyle's fingers moved across the keyboard. The boardroom held its breath in the particular way that expensive rooms do when they have run out of certainty. Dean stepped back slightly. He was still standing, still in his security uniform, and he was aware of every face in the room deciding what to do with him. Part of him wanted the number to be wrong, wanted to have misread it, wanted Kyle to look up and say everything checked out and allow him to walk back to his rounds and finish his shift and pick up Paige from the school breakfast program at 7:15 like every other Thursday. Kyle stopped typing. His expression changed, small at first, then not small at all. The imaging equipment schedule links to a depreciation table that hasn't been updated since the 2019 capital review, he said carefully. The PET CT 5 was installed in 2022. It's being valued against an archived impairment rate. Lawrence stood immediately. Transitional data errors happen during acquisition formatting. This is standard. This isn't a formatting error. Kyle turned the laptop slowly toward the room. The formula was manually overridden. The reference cell was replaced with a fixed value. The room changed. Not loudly. No one shouted. But something shifted in the way people were sitting, the way eyes were moving, and the way Lawrence Peel had stopped speaking. Dean had felt this moment before in other rooms, other buildings years ago. It was the moment when numbers stopped being numbers and became something with a motive behind them. Check the timestamps, Dean said quietly. Kyle looked at him. What? On the manual overrides, check when they were made. Kyle opened the metadata panel. His face went still. The last 3 formula changes were made at 11:58 p.m., 12:04 a.m., and 12:17 a.m. Which night? Catherine asked. 2 nights ago. Catherine's gaze moved toward Lawrence, who has editing access to those files at midnight. Lawrence folded his arms. Senior finance staff operate under shared directory credentials during acquisition preparation. That's procedurally standard. Kyle, Catherine said, pull the login audit. Kyle navigated without speaking. Another board member had moved to stand behind him now, watching the screen. Single user, Kyle said. He hesitated, then CFO credentials, all 3 edits. The room was very still. Dean did not speak. He watched Lawrence Peel's face the way he had learned to watch the corridors on night rounds, not looking for anything specific, just watching for the thing that did not belong. What appeared on Lawrence's face in the next 2 seconds was not guilt. It was calculation. I personally reviewed those files that night, Lawrence said. The timestamps are mine because the work was mine. I was correcting inherited errors from the Q3 reporting cycle. Correcting errors at midnight, Catherine said. Acquisitions don't follow office hours. Catherine turned back to Kyle. What does the corrected valuation look like if Dean's figures are applied? Kyle typed for nearly a full minute. Someone's phone lit up silently on the table. No one answered it. The total asset base increases by $73 million. No one spoke. Then a board member at the far end, an older man who had served on St. Margrave's board for longer than Dean had been alive, said quietly, "That changes the acquisition terms entirely." "It invalidates them," someone else said. Lawrence shifted his weight. One employee's reading of depreciation tables does not invalidate a 7-month acquisition process. No, Catherine said, voice measured and very calm, but manually altered formulas at midnight might. She pushed the unsigned acquisition agreement to the center of the table with 2 fingers, as though placing it under quarantine. Kyle, run the full asset schedule against the corrected values. Every linked table. I want a complete reconciliation before anyone leaves this room. Lawrence took a breath. Meridian's legal team is expecting confirmation by 6 a.m. Then they'll wait. For the first time that morning, Lawrence Peel had no immediate answer. Dean remained near the back wall, hands at his sides, while the room reorganized itself around spreadsheets and open laptops and voices that had shifted from resigned to urgent. Every 15 minutes, another figure surfaced. Medical equipment was not the only category that had been compressed. Accounts receivable had been discounted against an overstated bad debt provision. A building insurance settlement from the previous fiscal year had been recorded in a subsidiary ledger, but excluded from the consolidated summary. Alone, each discrepancy could have been a mistake. Together, they told a story with a direction. At one point, Catherine looked up from where she was standing beside Kyle's station. "Mr. Hollis, you said numbers don't go quiet when something's wrong. What does that mean?" He thought about how to answer honestly. "It means they stay in my peripheral vision until I figure out why they're out of place. It's not a skill. It's more like an inconvenience I've learned to use." She studied him the way someone does when they are deciding whether they're hearing truth or performance. Apparently, she decided on truth, because she continued. "Where did you study?" "University of Alberta, accounting and financial modeling, graduate level, 2 years. A pause I didn't finish." "Why not?" The room had gone quieter. Kyle had stopped typing, though he pretended he hadn't. Dean looked at a point on the table and not at anyone in particular. When he answered, his voice was even, without self-pity, the way someone talks about a thing they survived and stopped needing other people to understand. "My wife was diagnosed with ovarian cancer the year I was meant to defend my thesis. Treatment was in Edmonton. We were in Calgary. The driving, the appointments, the gaps between. I couldn't maintain the program and be there for her at the same time. So I left. She passed 14 months later. Our daughter was 3. He paused. Paige is 9 now. She's at home with the neighbor on nights I work." No one spoke. Kyle was no longer pretending to type. "After that, I did contract auditing to pay down what we owed. Then a permanent role at a supply firm. Then I decided I'd rather work nights and pick Paige up myself every morning than work days and pay someone else to do it." He looked at the floor briefly. "The hours fit. The work is quiet. That's been enough." The room held something after that sentence, not pity. Something more like recognition, the kind that lands differently in a room full of people who have never had to choose between a career trajectory and the kitchen table where their child eats breakfast. Catherine turned back to the screens without speaking, but her posture had changed. It was Kyle who broke the quiet. "There's something else." He moved to a new spreadsheet. 3 consulting disbursements in the past 8 months. Routed through a firm called Harwick Strategy Group. The name landed without recognition on most faces, but Dean watched Lawrence's hand tighten slightly on the back of a chair. "Total disbursements?" Catherine asked. $6.4 million. "Consulting for what?" Kyle opened the attached documentation. "The scope of work description is," he stopped. "There isn't one, just an invoice number and a project code." "Approved under what authority?" "CFO discretionary expenditure, emergency procurement category." "Lawrence," Catherine said, "what did Harwick Strategy Group deliver?" Lawrence's composure had not broken, but it had thinned. Restructuring advisory, external specialists brought in during a crisis period, standard protocol for acquisitions of this scale. Without board visibility. Under my authority. Dean was looking at the invoice dates on Kyle's screen. Something in the sequence was pulling at him the way numbers always did when their pattern had been arranged by something other than coincidence. "Those payments went out in the same weeks that the acquisition narrative changed," he said, almost to himself. Kyle cross-referenced without being asked. "He's right. First payment, same week Meridian's initial offer was reframed as a stabilization option. Second payment, same week the solvency projections were revised downward." Catherine moved to the terminal herself. "Who owns Harwick Strategy Group?" Kyle searched. His face went carefully neutral. "Incorporated 11 months ago. Named director is a numbered holding company registered in Alberta." He typed further. "The registered address on the holding company matches Meridian Health Group's Canadian legal counsel." The room understood what that meant before anyone said it aloud. The investor waiting to acquire St. Margrave General at a depressed valuation was connected. through a chain of incorporated entities, to the firm that had received $6.4 million in payments approved exclusively by the hospital's chief financial officer. Lawrence Peel said nothing. That silence was its own answer. Catherine's voice went very calm, the kind of calm that is not the absence of anger but its sharpest form. "You will stay in this building until our legal team arrives." "Catherine, think carefully," Lawrence said. "If this goes further, it will go further accurately, which is better than the alternative." Lawrence looked around the room for something, support, uncertainty, an exit, and found none. The board members who had arrived as his colleagues had rearranged themselves, quietly and completely, into something else. He was escorted to a side office by two people who did not need to raise their voices to communicate what was expected of him. When the door closed behind them, the room exhaled. Catherine stood at the window. Through the broad glass, the city lights of Vancouver spread in every direction beneath a sky that was still dark but beginning to hold the suggestion of morning somewhere past the water and the mountains. She did not speak for a moment, then, "I need to tell you something." Dean waited. "Lawrence came to me 7 months ago with a full analysis. He said the hospital's equipment was aging faster than our revenue could support, that we were 6 months from an irreversible liquidity crisis." She looked at the city and not at Dean. "I believed him. I almost signed tonight because I believed every number he showed me." Dean was quiet. "Why did you come through that door?" she asked. "You knew it could cost you this job if you were wrong." He thought about Paige that morning, eating oatmeal with the last of the brown sugar, saying completely unprompted, "Dad, this is your best one yet," as though every version of his life was the best version. He thought about how she had no idea what he used to be, what he had set down and walked away from, and still looked at him like he was exactly enough. "Those machines on the 3rd floor," he said, "kept my wife alive for 14 months when the numbers said she had fewer. I know what they're worth. Someone was telling this hospital they weren't worth keeping." He looked at Catherine. "I wasn't going to let that go past me." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, the formal board session is at 7. I'd like you to be there." "My daughter's school starts at 8:15. I walk her. We'll be done by 7:40. He thought about arguing. He decided against it. At the formal session, the forensic reconstruction filled 3 screens. Kyle presented it with the steadiness of someone who had decided the truth was less frightening than its alternative. Rebecca Dollywall, the hospital's external legal counsel, arrived at 5:30 and moved through the documentation with the precision of someone who had spent 2 decades finding the single sentence that ends a conversation. By 6:20, Meridian Health Group's legal team dialed in from Toronto had gone very quiet. At 6:35, the acquisition agreement was withdrawn from consideration pending fraud investigation. At 6:48, Lawrence Peel was escorted to a private room with 2 lawyers present and no device access. The board vote was brief and unanimous. No sale, no restructuring through Meridian channels, an independent audit to begin immediately. Criminal referral for the falsified disclosures. When the room began to empty, Catherine asked everyone except Dean to give them the space. She sat across from him at the long table, in the gray pre-dawn light that was coming through the glass now in real earnest. She slid a folder in front of him. "I want to offer you a role, not as a gesture, as a correction." He opened it, Director of Financial Integrity, full-time executive level. He read it without rushing. "I can't do standard executive hours." "I know. Paige has piano on Tuesdays until 4:30. I pick her up myself." "Noted. If her school calls, I leave, whatever is happening." "You leave." He turned 1 page. He was quiet for a moment. "Before I answer, the overnight maintenance staff haven't had a benefits review in 3 years. I know because I've spoken to them. 2 of the cleaners are supporting dependents with medical needs, and their coverage hasn't kept pace with what they're actually paying in premiums." Catherine looked at him steadily. "Fix that first," he said. "Then I'll give you an answer about this." She held his gaze for a moment, then she gave a single short nod. "Done. The cafeteria staff on overnight rotation receive a shift differential that I'm fairly sure sits below the provincial threshold. I'll review it this week." He closed the folder. Outside, through the east-facing window, the sky above the mountains beyond Burrard Inlet had turned a thin, pale gold. The first light that was not electric. The kind of light that made the city look like something that had survived the night and was quietly relieved about it. "You know," Catherine said, almost to herself, "Lawrence told me that no credible turnaround story ends with a security guard." She looked at the folder. "He said it, as though that settled something." Dean looked out at the mountains, not on his paper, he said. She almost smiled. It was the first thing approaching warmth she had allowed herself since before sunrise. He stood, collected his jacket, and left the folder on the table, not as a refusal, but as a thing he needed to consider in daylight, with a 9-year-old's voice nearby, where he could trust his own answer. Paige was waiting on the front steps of Mrs. Gauthier's house on Cardero Street in her parka and rain boots, backpack over both shoulders, a piece of toast in one hand. She heard his footsteps before she saw him and was already waving by the time he turned the corner onto the block. "You're late," she said when he reached the gate. "Big night at work." She looked at him the way she always looked at him, the particular attention of a child who has learned to read the silences between words. "Did something happen?" He knelt to zip her jacket higher against the morning damp. "Yeah, something happened." "Good or bad?" He thought about Lawrence's face when the login timestamps had appeared on the screen. About Catherine's hand loosening on the pen she had nearly used to end 4,000 people's livelihoods before breakfast. About the folder still sitting on a table 32 floors above the street, waiting for him to come back to it. "Complicated," he said. "I'll explain when you're older." Paige considered this for approximately 1 second. "How old?" 12. "That's 3 whole years." "That's right." She took his hand as they started walking, which she had recently announced she was far too old to do, but did anyway whenever she thought he looked tired. She did not remark on it, and neither did he. Above them, the mountains beyond the city were visible in the clear morning for the first time in days. Snow-capped and enormous and completely indifferent to everything that had happened on the 6th floor of St. Margrave General through the long hours of the night. They looked the way mountains always look, as though they had been there before all of it, and intended to be there well after. Paige tossed the last of her toast to a crow on a fence post. It took the crust and flew without ceremony. "Did you help someone?" she asked. Dean looked at her. "You always look like that when you helped someone," she said, as though this were the most unremarkable observation in the world. "Kind of tired, but not the bad kind." He did not answer right away. He watched the crow disappear between 2 buildings, just a dark shape finding its way through the morning. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think so." She nodded, satisfied, and shifted her backpack higher on her shoulders. They walked the rest of the way to school through the early Vancouver morning, wet pavement holding the reflection of clouds and new light in equal measure. While 2 kilometers away, a hospital continued to exist because a man on night shift had picked up a piece of paper from the floor and, just this once, refused to put it back down.